Good morning, Ohio. It's James Ernest of the Grueling Truth Radio Network here with Jonathan Gelber, author of the new book, Tiger Woods' Back and Tommy John's Elbow, Injuries and Tragedies That Transform Career, Sports, and Society. Thank you, Doc, for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So what originally got you interested in medicine?
So, I've been a lifelong athlete. So when I got hurt, as a kid, I'd always go see my friend's dad, who was an orthopedic surgeon. So when I decided I wanted to become a doctor, I really just knew that I wanted to be an orthopedic surgeon. I sort of asked my mom and dad, what kind of doc is he? And they said, orthopedic sports doc. I said, okay, well, that's what I want to be. So and I even knew that going into college that I always wanted to be an orthopedic sports medicine doc.
Oh, nice. So basically a family friend, kind of a role model, it sounds like.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he sort of was my role model for what I wanted to do to get people back out onto the athletic field or, get rid of their pain and get them back to their jobs.
You mentioned your athletic background. What sports did you play growing up?
So growing up, I was big into baseball, basketball, and soccer for the different seasons. In college, I started to get involved in some jiu-jitsu. There was actually one of the original Gracie academies in the U.S., and this is when Hoist was still fighting in the UFC. So I started getting involved in jiu-jitsu at that point and some mixed martial arts contacts. And this is before even the term mixed martial arts existed. So we didn't even have that term. The Brazilians called it vale tudo. Some other people called it no holds barred. So we didn't have it everywhere like we do today. Now you see MMA training everywhere and jiu-jitsu everywhere. Back then there was only a handful of schools in the entire country where you could actually train jiu-jitsu.
With your background in medicine, did that help with your training? Did to what to avoid, that kind of thing?
Yeah, you'd think it could apply, but really, I could never figure out a way to use it. Even things like arm bars, for like elbows. Certain positions you can sink an arm bar, and other ones it doesn't affect them too much. And never been able to figure all the anatomy out that makes it unique. So unfortunately, I don't know any secret pressure points or any secret techniques to submit somebody. But I mean, certainly the anatomy is always interesting.
So what inspired you to write the book?
Well, I originally started to write some stuff on the Tommy John epidemic that we have today. So Tommy John was a pitcher, if everybody's not familiar with him, who tore the inner ligament on his elbow. And so a doctor by the name of Frank Jobe actually reconstructed his elbow ligament so that he could go back to pitching. And he was quite successful. Almost, most of his wins, or half of his wins happened after the surgery. So he had a long, successful career, and so that's certainly a good thing. But what a lot of us docs have noticed, and some other coaches, and even Tommy John's own family, is that it's sort of become an epidemic that kids are relying on this surgery as a crutch. They see it as a rite of passage, and a lot of them are misinformed. Even the coaches in MLB media for a long time thought it was a performance enhancement. You didn't need an injury to have this surgery. So there's a lot of misinformation. So I wanted to talk about that. But I started to see that there were a lot of other stories where we thought we knew how they ended once the injury or tragedy was over. But really, these injuries and tragedies I discuss in the book, they move beyond the sport and into society, whether it was Magic Johnson, Lyle Alzada, Hank Gathers, Len Bias, even Tom Brady. We have a lot of these injuries and tragedies that transform sports and often society themselves, and that's the story I wanted to tell.
Well, I mean, I did see that documentary about Tommy John surgery, Rookie of the Year. That's a documentary, right?
Right. I always think of that, and the younger people, they don't get that. But hey, that reference, when you think about, okay, it's going to tighten you up, they're going to be a little tighter, and then he brings his arm back and lets it rip. So, yeah, that's what I think of when I think about people thinking about it being a performance enhancer.
So, with your story, or with your book, it feels like you looked at things at a different perspective, a new perspective on the traditional narratives. Why did you do that? What inspired that?
So, I've been a big fan of writers like Malcolm Gladwell, David Epstein, who wrote The Sports Gene. And they like to take stories and they like to spin them around. Malcolm Gladwell had a book, David and Goliath, where he talked about how sometimes it may not be that David was that accurate, but maybe Goliath couldn't see. So you have this idea where there's a story and you think you know how it plays out, but really, if you flip it around, there's another story there. And so that's how I wanted to tackle these stories.
Now, when it comes to Tommy John and other repeat injuries, a lot of people go back to the 1,000-hour theory. Do you feel that that's kind of a valid either cause or solution to the problem?
In terms of a limited number of pitches, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah. Pitching is really a total body thing, so certainly mechanics play a role in that. But if you look at some of the pitchers, if you just go to Google and Google some pitchers and how far they're bringing their arm back, there's incredible stresses across the elbow. And there are things that we can do to minimize your injury, though, and some of those are things, especially at the youth level, like not playing baseball year-round. Tommy John himself, he was actually a basketball player. He had tons of basketball scholarships and one offer for baseball, and he went to baseball. And to him, baseball was something you did between basketball seasons, and that's, even when I was growing up, that's how it was. You had a fall sport, you had a winter sport, you had a spring sport, you took the summer off. And unfortunately, that's changed today, and people are playing sports year-round, and so one major risk factor is playing baseball year-round, not having 2 or 3 months off. So that's something that is preventable. Other things like pitch counts, those are something that has been shown to reduce injuries in the elbows, especially at the youth level. So there are things that we could be doing that people aren't doing to reduce that risk of injury.
Exactly. It kind of feels like, and I think the stats will show that like the 300-win pitchers, most of them are from the north where they weren't able to pitch year-round. Yeah,
there's actually a great graph out there. It was done a couple of years ago, so it's a little older now, but yeah, they basically did all the 300-game winners, and if you draw the Mason-Dixon line separating north from the south, you see the majority of them were from the north. That's exactly correct.
So, obviously, I'm going to throw out another reference that most of my younger listeners won't get, but the Cobra effect. So tell us about Dave Parker. Tell us about what the Cobra effect is.
Yeah, so Cobra effect, which is the underlying theme of the book. So like Malcolm Gladwell had a 10,000-hour rule, I would consider the Cobra effect to be my takeaway message from this book. And so the Cobra effect, it actually is a relation to a story that's told about Imperial India, where they had too many venomous cobras. And so there was a bounty placed on the skins of cobras because the government figured if people killed the snakes, bought them in for the bounty, the population would go down. So they started to see people bringing in basket loads of snake skins, but the population of the cobras did not change. And so after some investigation, they saw that they were actually farming the cobras. And so once they found this out, they stopped the program, and all these farmers that were raising cobras just to be killed had nothing to do with these cobras, so they released them back into the wild. So now all of a sudden you have a spike in the cobra population. So initially their intent was to reduce it, and they in fact actually made the problem worse. So that's the Cobra effect, where you think you're doing something for a positive, and you actually have an opposite and unintended consequence. And so that's the Cobra effect. And I look at each of these stories from the lens of the Cobra effect.
Interesting. Is injury prevention being overlooked, or is that something that they need to put more emphasis on?
I think many organizations have that message, but unfortunately at the same time, I've heard other, folks tell me, whether it's the media or in the organizations themselves, it's often easier to send somebody to the elbow surgeon than it is to implement a club-wide or team-wide or league-wide injury prevention program. So, the message is there, but whether it's being implemented, that's really the big question. So there's a lot of education and a lot of, unfortunately, for some people, effort and money that is needed to get this stuff done. And so that's really the message, that we need to do as far as with the Tommy John surgery is education. We don't want to make the problem worse because we have this solution. We have to do other solutions that are not surgical.
So it seems like once the athlete has gotten to you, there already is a problem. Who should be on the front lines to fix the problem? Who should be doing the preventative work?
Yeah. That's something that we deal with every day. We get, by the time I see the athlete in the office, if they have a ligament torn, well, that's already the end of the problem scale there. Or even if it's a young pitcher and the elbow's starting to hurt, that's a warning sign where at least I can say, hey, you need to slow down. But it's really the parents It's the coaches. It's the athletic trainers. It's even the friends. There's a lot of pressure on kids today to play year-round. They don't want to let their team down if their arm's hurting, so they might pitch through pain. There's a lot of pressures, and really I think the people that are closest to the young athletes especially are going to be their parents and their coaches. So they really got to talk to them, and they have to communicate, and sometimes you have to protect the athlete from themselves.
In the title, it mentions society, and I feel that one of the biggest things in sports that affected society, would you agree that?
I think that was one of the big ones that I mentioned in the book. So the Magic Johnson one is an interesting story because he did a lot, and his wife has done a lot in terms of educating the public, especially at that time. When he was diagnosed, he made his famous announcement that he was infected with the HIV virus. We were very worried about social contact. People, even in the NBA, wouldn't play against him, and they were worried about contracting it through sweat. So there was a lot of social education that had to happen. An interesting effect with Magic was when he made his announcement, there actually was an increased number of testing, and there's actually graphs in the book and studies that people have done looking before and after his announcement at different populations to see, did that have an effect? And a lot of groups had an effect. They went out and they got tested, but that effect didn't last very long. The effect that seemed to last the longest was the white heterosexual male population, and they're actually the least likely to have HIV. The ones that had the greatest risk were the African American females. And so it was really maybe Cookie that we should have been looking to, his wife, to help get that message across. She's done a lot now, and certainly, his organization and his foundation, they've done tons of great work. But if we were to rewind the clock, I think maybe we should have focused a little more on the Cookie effect, not the Magic Johnson effect.
Do you feel steroids is something that is changing society as well? Are people learning to avoid it because of what they've seen with athletes and their injuries, or is that something that really is kind of getting overlooked?
So in the chapter we talk about steroids and Lyle Alzada being the wrong face of steroids. And Lyle, when he ended up with lymphoma, a brain cancer, and he blamed it on steroids, which is, it's possible, but it's probably unlikely that that's what causes steroids. And so, at the time and even now, we blame steroids for a lot of things that they could cause. One of them is roid rage. That's a real thing. It's increased testosterone and aggression, but it's not the most common. And so one of the problems we've had is we've been trying to talk to athletes and bodybuilders about steroids. We've been focusing on the wrong problems. We've been focusing on roid rage, and Lyle was focusing on his cancer, whereas there's other real, more common problems like cardiovascular disease, like depression, and so those are the more common side effects. And so the problem was when we weren't talking about the real effects, we were talking about these rare effects, the bodybuilders and a lot of the athletes, they just shut off listening. And so that conversation, unfortunately, it's been driven underground because of the wrong approach that we as a society took to steroids in, the 90s and the early 2000s.
One of the other ones I think in the book that I think is big about society is drug use, especially the Lynn bias effect. Do you feel that there were any positives that came from what happened to him, or is just a tragedy all the way around?
Yeah, that I think of all the stories in the book, I think that one actually has the greatest effect because we're still dealing with that today in our legal and our justice system. Because when Len died, for those of the younger folks who don't remember Len Bias, he was the number one draft pick. He was going to be the next Michael Jordan, drafted by the Boston Celtics to play next to Larry Bird. And after he was drafted that weekend, he overdosed on cocaine, and so the number one NBA draft pick for Boston dies of drug overdose. And so at the time, crack cocaine was an epidemic, not the powdered form that Len probably used, but crack cocaine. And so laws were passed, and his death was sort of a lightning rod for the war on drugs. And so the weighted minimum sentencing was actually much higher for the crack form than the powder form. So you had a lot of low-level street dealers and low-level people with possession of crack who are getting these disproportionately higher sentences, most of them being African-American. And so many people in the jails now from these problems can be traced back to Len bias. And the government is still trying to reform this. There were some done under Barack Obama. Even now there's talk about retroactively, changing these sentences. So, that is a huge problem. It is good that we did focus on the crack problem. Obviously that's bad, but we also didn't focus enough on the cocaine, or we heavily weighted the crack problem, and that was why it became disproportionate. So yes, it's good that we certainly tried to address the drug problem, but by so heavily weighting the crack over the powder form of cocaine, we kind of missed the mark on that a little bit.
Before we let you go, where on social media, where on the web should they check you out at to learn more about your book?
So I'm on Twitter at Jonathan Gelber. My website, if you need to email me, is drjohngelber.com. But the book's very easily accessible. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it at Barnes & Noble. You can also get it at your local book dealer. And it just came out last week, so there should be plenty of copies available.
Awesome. So I'd like to thank our guest, Dr. Jonathan Gelber, author of Tiger Woods Back and Tommy John's Elbow, Injuries and Tragedies that Transform Career, Sports, and Society. Thank you, Doc, for joining us today.
Thanks. My pleasure. Happy to come back and talk injuries anytime.